Liverpool, 1996. Two men, John Hayes and Paul Bennett, walked out of prison after serving less than a year of their 18-year sentences. Their crime? Smuggling millions of pounds worth of heroin into Britain. Their release? A royal pardon signed by the Home Secretary himself. To the public, it seemed unthinkable. How could two of Liverpool's most notorious drug dealers suddenly become heroes of law enforcement? Officials claimed they had provided critical information that led to the seizure of dangerous firearms across the country. The story painted them as informants who had helped protect the nation from violent crime. But beneath that official narrative, something felt off. The timing was too perfect, the evidence too convenient, and the outcome too unbelievable. It was as if two career criminals had managed to rewrite their own history in less than a year. What followed would unravel one of the most stunning manipulations in modern British justice, a deception so deep it reached the highest levels of power. Liverpool in the early 1990s was a city struggling to recover from years of economic decline. Shipyards had closed, factories had disappeared, and entire communities were left without work. In the absence of opportunity, another industry began to rise, one built on drugs, intimidation, and quick money. At the center of it all stood John Hayes and his nephew, Paul Bennett. Both men were well known to police long before their names hit national headlines. They were not small-time criminals. Their history included armed robberies, smuggling operations, and a network that reached far beyond Merseyside. Haas, in particular, carried himself with the confidence of a man who understood power, both inside the criminal world and outside it. By the early 90s, Haas's influence stretched across borders. He became linked to international heroin routes, including one controlled by a Turkish trafficker known as Volkan. In 1993, British Customs and Excise officers traced a major shipment of heroin worth around $18 million heading toward Liverpool. It was one of the largest drug operations of its time, evidence of a well-organized empire that blended local street control with international coordination. For communities already torn apart by addiction, Haas's empire brought only more destruction. The flow of heroin from his network fed a growing underworld economy, one where violence was currency and loyalty came at a price. Every deal, every shipment, every payoff deepened the city's dependence on crime as survival. To the authorities, men like Haas and Bennett represented the dark evolution of organized crime in Britain. No longer crude gangsters with shotguns, but businessmen of the underground, fluent in both fear and manipulation. Their empire wasn't built overnight. It was crafted through calculation, ruthlessness, and the knowledge that in Liverpool's broken economy, crime had become the only business still booming. By 1993, British Customs and Excise had spent months piecing together one of the most complex drug investigations in the country's history. The target was a massive heroin network stretching from Turkey to the streets of Liverpool, a pipeline controlled by hardened traffickers and professional smugglers. At the heart of it stood John Hayes and Paul Bennett, two men who had become masters of avoiding capture. The investigation was led by Paul Cook, a determined customs officer who refused to let the pair slip through his grasp. Surveillance teams followed coded messages, hidden shipments, and suspicious movements across ports and warehouses. Every clue pointed toward one enormous delivery, an $18 million consignment of heroin destined for Liverpool. It was the key that would finally expose the scale of Haas's criminal empire. When the operation moved in, dozens of arrests were made across the city. Vehicles were seized, storage sites raided, and drugs confiscated. Yet amid the chaos, Haas and Bennett managed to vanish. For a brief moment, it seemed the masterminds had escaped once again, but their luck was running out. Acting on intelligence, officers tracked them down hundreds of miles away in Croydon, South London. The arrest was quiet but decisive. After years of slipping through cracks in the system, Haas and Bennett were finally in custody. The empire they had built on deception and violence was exposed to the full weight of British law. For investigators, it felt like justice had prevailed. But what they didn't yet realize was that this victory was only temporary. Behind Haas's silence lay another plan, one that would soon turn the justice system itself into his next and most powerful victim. The courtroom in 1995 was tense. After years of investigation, John Haas and Curtis Warren's associate, Paul Bennett, finally stood before Judge David Lynch. The evidence was solid: drug trafficking, smuggling, and the movement of massive quantities of narcotics across Britain. For the prosecution, this was a long-awaited victory. When Judge Lynch delivered his decision, the verdict carried the weight of years of pursuit. Both men were sentenced to 18 years in prison. It seemed like the end of a criminal chapter that had drained law enforcement resources and humiliated customs officials time and again. But what appeared to be closure was, in truth, only the beginning of a darker story. Haas wasn't the type to sit quietly and accept defeat. Behind the walls of his cell, his mind began to turn. He understood the justice system, its weaknesses, its need for results, and its hunger for intelligence. Together with his solicitor, Tony Nelson, Haas began exploring an opportunity. If he could make himself valuable, the system might listen. Nelson approached senior officers in Her Majesty's Customs and Excise, proposing a deal. Haas and Bennett, he claimed, had crucial information that could help the authorities uncover hidden weapon caches scattered across Liverpool. At first, the proposal sounded absurd: two convicted drug traffickers offering to expose arms dumps. Yet the climate of the mid-1990s made such offers tempting. Britain was still haunted by fears of gang violence and organised crime. Any tip that could reduce weapons on the streets was worth hearing. And so, discussions began. What followed was a negotiation that blurred the line between justice and deception. Haas and Bennett began feeding intelligence to customs. They provided details, locations of warehouses, storage units, and derelict properties where illegal arms were supposedly hidden. Each new lead produced results. Weapons were indeed found: handguns, shotguns, ammunition. Every recovery seemed to confirm the men's credibility. The operation was hailed as a breakthrough, and their cooperation became a public success story. But beneath the praise, doubt was growing. Some investigators questioned how two prisoners could have such precise knowledge of hidden weapons. The pattern was too neat, too consistent. Each discovery strengthened Haas's image as a valuable informant, conveniently justifying his early release. What few realized was that the entire operation was being manipulated from within. Haas and Bennett were not exposing the criminal underworld, they were orchestrating it. They allegedly directed associates on the outside to plant weapons in specific locations, only to reveal those sites later through their intelligence reports. The system, desperate for progress, failed to question the pattern. Each successful recovery made the deception more believable. In this intricate performance, the justice system became both audience and accomplice. The line between criminal and informant blurred completely. Haas and Bennett were no longer just convicts. They had turned themselves into assets, masters of perception, who played law enforcement's ambitions against itself. When officials finally realized the scale of the manipulation, the damage was already done. The credibility of the intelligence program had been compromised, and the courts had unknowingly rewarded deception. Haas's sentence was reduced, his cooperation publicly praised, and his name quietly removed from the list of dangerous offenders. What began as an 18-year punishment had evolved into a demonstration of how deeply the justice system could be exploited from within. Haas and Bennett had turned their convictions into opportunities, transforming their downfall into leverage. Their story was no longer just about crime, it was about control, about the unsettling power of knowing exactly how to make the system believe in a lie. And for a time, the lie worked perfectly. The discovery of weapons across Liverpool stunned the authorities. Each new find, handguns, assault rifles, submachine guns, and even explosives, appeared to confirm the credibility of John Haas and Paul Bennett. The intelligence they provided seemed almost miraculous. In the eyes of officials, these were not just prisoners. They were informants whose cooperation had directly prevented potential bloodshed. Reports from customs officers highlighted how their information had led to the recovery of more than 50 weapons in total, a figure that impressed even the highest levels of government. Inside Whitehall, conversations began to shift. Could these men, despite their crimes, have genuinely redeemed themselves? Could their extraordinary help justify an act of mercy? Then, Home Secretary Michael Howard believed so. Acting on the recommendation of senior officials, he took an unprecedented step. In July 1996, both Haas and Bennett were granted a royal pardon, a rare and extraordinary form of clemency that effectively erased the bulk of their 18-year prison sentences. Howard defended his decision publicly, describing their cooperation as enormous and unique assistance to law enforcement. According to his statement, their intelligence had directly saved lives and dismantled dangerous criminal networks. The narrative was one of redemption and gratitude, where justice could be balanced by forgiveness. But outside government offices, the public reaction was one of disbelief and anger. The press quickly turned the story into a national scandal. Headlines questioned how two convicted drug traffickers, men responsible for flooding communities with heroin and cocaine, had walked free in less than a year. Families torn apart by addiction watched as the same justice system that had promised protection now seemed to reward the very architects of their misery. Critics called it a betrayal, an insult to the victims of the drug trade. Investigators who had worked on the case were equally uneasy. To them, something felt wrong. The efficiency of Haas's intelligence had seemed almost too perfect, too rehearsed. Rumors began to circulate that the weapons found had been deliberately planted. The so-called informants were not exposing Liverpool's criminal underworld, they were choreographing it. Still, for a brief moment, Haas and Bennett stood as examples of cooperation triumphing over crime. They were treated as rehabilitated men who had done their duty to society. Their release was presented as proof that even hardened criminals could contribute to the greater good if given the right incentive. But beneath that polished narrative, the cracks were already showing. What had begun as an act of mercy would soon unravel into one of the most embarrassing episodes in modern British justice. The royal pardon that once symbolized redemption would later become a cautionary tale, a case study in how manipulation, ambition, and misplaced trust could twist the system against itself. Haas and Bennett had not only deceived the authorities, they had managed to turn the machinery of justice into an accomplice. By exploiting its hunger for success, they walked free as national controversy exploded around them. The public was left questioning how the government could have been so easily misled, and whether justice in Britain was truly blind or simply naive. In the end, the royal pardon stood as more than a scandal. It exposed a painful contradiction at the heart of the system. Criminals rewarded for their cunning, while the real victims, families destroyed by drugs, communities fractured by violence, were left without justice, watching the men who had ruined lives step back into freedom. The royal pardon had been celebrated by some as a bold decision, but within months, doubts began to surface. Officers who had worked on the original investigation started to question the legitimacy of Haas and Bennett's so-called intelligence. Something about the whole operation didn't sit right. The weapons they claimed to have helped recover were almost too conveniently placed, hidden in locations that appeared staged rather than discovered through genuine criminal connections. Among senior figures in customs and the police, quiet conversations turned into open skepticism. Some began to suspect that Haas had orchestrated the entire affair himself, arranging for weapons to be planted so he could reveal them later and win his freedom. The theory was chilling, but it made sense. It fit the pattern of a manipulator who understood exactly how to exploit a system desperate for results. One of the most vocal critics was Liverpool MP Peter Kilfoyle. He couldn't accept that two high-level drug traffickers, men responsible for flooding the city with heroin, had been released after only serving a fraction of their sentences. Kilfoyle took the matter to Parliament, demanding explanations from government officials who had approved the pardon. His questions were sharp, relentless, and public. In the House of Commons, ministers struggled to justify the decision. They spoke of unique cooperation and national security, but the excuses rang hollow. To the public, it now seemed clear that the government had been duped. The same justice system meant to protect society had been manipulated by two criminals who knew exactly where its weaknesses lay. The cracks were no longer hidden, they were widening fast. And as pressure mounted on both the Home Office and law enforcement, one question began to echo across the country. How could this have happened? By 2003, the scandal surrounding John Haas and Paul Bennett took a darker turn. Reports emerged suggesting that their miraculous release from prison might not have been the result of goodwill or intelligence after all, but of something far more sinister: money. Investigators began tracing financial movements linked to Simon Bakerman, a known associate of Haas. According to reports, Bakerman had allegedly received a £400,000 bribe connected to the royal pardon. The claim sent shockwaves through the political establishment. While there was never any proven link to then Home Secretary Michael Howard, the damage to public confidence was immediate and severe. The notion that Britain's justice system could be manipulated not only by deception, but potentially by corruption cut deep. It struck at the heart of government credibility and called into question every decision surrounding Haas's early release. The media seized the story with ferocity. Headlines accused officials of negligence, while talk shows and newspapers dissected every element of the pardon process. Reporters revisited court documents, prison records, and government communications, looking for inconsistencies and unanswered questions. Every statement made during the original investigation was now being reinterpreted through a new lens, one of suspicion. Haas's image, already that of a calculating criminal, grew more sinister. He was no longer seen as just a manipulator of the legal system, but as a man who may have bought his way out of justice. For the public, the affair became a symbol of everything wrong, with the intersection of crime and politics, a system where influence, deceit, and greed appeared to carry more weight than truth or accountability. And as the allegations deepened, one thing became clear. This was no longer just a case of criminal deception. It had become a question of how far corruption could reach inside the very institutions meant to prevent it. In 2004, more than a decade after his release, John Haas finally broke his silence, and what he revealed shattered what little credibility the story still had. In a sworn affidavit, Haas admitted what many had long suspected. It was a con all the way. Those 6 words rewrote the entire narrative of his so-called cooperation with the authorities. Haas confessed that he and Paul Bennett had engineered the entire weapons recovery scheme from inside prison. Using a network of trusted associates on the outside, they had arranged for firearms, explosives, and ammunition to be hidden in predetermined locations across Liverpool. Once the weapons were in place, Haas passed their whereabouts to investigators, posing as an informant helping to clean up the city. The police, eager for results, followed the leads and were stunned by the scale of the discoveries, never realizing they were pawns in a calculated deception. Haas's manipulation was as bold as it was methodical. He understood how deeply the justice system wanted to believe it was making progress against organised crime. He exploited that desperation with surgical precision, feeding officials exactly what they wanted to hear. The entire operation, praised at the time as a triumph of cooperation, had been nothing more than a masterclass in deceit. For years, Haas had lived under the illusion of legitimacy, hailed as a criminal turned ally. But with this confession, that illusion was destroyed. What had once been portrayed as an act of redemption was exposed as a betrayal of the courts, the government, and the very system that had freed him. The truth was simple, brutal, and undeniable. Britain's justice system hadn't outsmarted John Haas. It had been played by him from the very beginning. In 2008, after years of silence and speculation, the story of John Haas and Paul Bennett came full circle. What began as a tale of redemption had rotted into one of the biggest embarrassments in British justice. The very system that once freed them now stood ready to put them back behind bars, this time for deceiving the government itself. The trial was a public reckoning. Evidence laid bare how Haas and Bennett had manipulated police, prosecutors, and even the Home Office through a web of calculated lies. They had staged the weapons recoveries that once earned them a royal pardon, tricking the authorities into believing they had dismantled a criminal network.
It wasn't a mistake. It was a performance, and for years, it worked. Witnesses described how the pair orchestrated every move from inside their prison cells. They had arranged the hiding of weapons,
tipped off investigators, and posed as informants helping to clean up Liverpool's streets. Their so-called cooperation had been nothing more than a ruse, a deliberate attempt to corrupt the justice process for their own freedom. When the verdict was delivered, it carried the weight of years of anger and humiliation. Both men were found guilty of perverting the course of justice, one of the most serious offences in British law. Haas was sentenced to 22 years in prison, Bennett to 20. For the first time, justice had truly caught up with them. During the aftermath, former MP Peter Kilfoyle summed up the nation's frustration in one haunting line: "Everybody was duped by two career criminals." Those words echoed through courtrooms, newsrooms, and the corridors of power, a reminder of how far the deception had reached. The scandal exposed a deep flaw in the system. It showed how easily desperation could cloud judgment, how the pursuit of results could open doors for manipulation. The government's eagerness to claim victory in the fight against organised crime had blinded it to the possibility of being played. For Haas and Bennett, the illusion had finally collapsed. Their calculated plan to appear as reformed informants had spiraled into national disgrace. The royal pardon that once symbolized their triumph became the very proof of their deceit. Every favor, every lie, every ounce of trust they had gained was stripped away in public view. The 2008 conviction wasn't just about two criminals being punished. It was about restoring credibility to a justice system that had been humiliated. Britain had been forced to admit its mistake, yet in doing so, it reclaimed something far more valuable than pride: the truth. Haas and Bennett's downfall stood as a brutal lesson in how corruption doesn't always come from the shadows. It sometimes grows within the system itself. And when the truth finally surfaced, it left a permanent scar on British justice, a reminder that even the cleverest lies eventually collapse under the weight of reality. The story of John Hayes and Paul Bennett did not end with their conviction. Its impact reached far beyond two men and their crimes. The scandal forced Britain to confront an uncomfortable truth: that even the most powerful institutions can be deceived when ambition overrides caution. The Home Office, the police, and the courts had all been manipulated. What began as a bold effort to fight organised crime turned into a public lesson in how desperation for results can lead to dangerous compromises. In their eagerness to claim success, officials ignored warning signs and handed freedom to men who had built their lives on deceit. The royal pardon, once a symbol of mercy and trust, became a reminder of political failure. Inside the justice system, the fallout was intense. Procedures for dealing with informants were rewritten. Senior officials were questioned. Every future decision involving criminal cooperation was now shadowed by suspicion. Haas and Bennett's actions had damaged not just reputations, but faith in the system itself. What made the case so haunting was how easily it happened. Two seasoned criminals had managed to outwit an entire network of prosecutors, intelligence officers, and government ministers. Their manipulation wasn't born out of genius, but out of understanding, knowing exactly what those in power wanted to believe. Years later, one question still lingers like a warning. If it happened once, could it happen again? The Haas scandal remains a symbol of vulnerability within British justice, a stark reminder that corruption doesn't always come from outside the system. Sometimes it grows quietly within, feeding on ambition and trust. And while justice eventually caught up, the stain of that deception continues to remind Britain that truth, in the wrong hands, can be turned into the perfect lie.